Hi, I want to thank everyone for joining us today. We're about to get started, so please come on back to your computer, grab yourself a cup of coffee, and give me about 2 minutes, and we'll begin our presentation. So you know you're in the right place. All right. I want to thank everyone for showing up today to launch to bring about the release of my new book, From Slavery to Segregation: Reckoning with White Supremacy in the American South. I know some of my students from Southeastern are out there. Some of my students from St. Ben's are out there. So hello, everyone. Some of my colleagues here, of course, at the university as well. And kind of looking at the screen before me, it reminds me of that old saying that some folks have a face for radio. Now I know exactly what they mean. Kind of looking at my mugshot on the screen here. But one of the things, my name is Keith Finley, of course, and I am the Assistant Director of the Center for Southeast Louisiana Studies here at Southeastern Louisiana University. I'm also an Associate Professor of History here at Southeastern. I've been here for the past 20 years or so Southeast Louisiana is effectively my home, even though it's not where I was born and raised. And of course, when dealing with a book like this, with such a negative, kind of depressing subject matter, folks often ask me, how in the world do you get interested in something like this? And of course, people ask that question even more so when they find out that I'm originally from New York. And that, of course, raises questions. Well, how in the world does a New York Yankee get interested in this period of history in this group of individuals? And I want to spend a little bit of time talking about how this all came about, and then spend a little bit of time sharing with you some of the main features and things that we talk about in the book. This is a book. This is a book that really begins back a couple of decades ago. Honestly, I could go all the way back to an undergraduate classroom at Little Gettysburg College when I could say this is the moment when this started. But I'll spare you that longer story. Give you kind of the abbreviated version of that. When I was a master's student, one of the things I was spending a lot of time looking into was Lyndon Johnson's time in the United States Senate, not his presidential life, but his time as the Senate Majority Leader. I spent a lot of time assessing what made Lyndon Johnson an effective leader, looking at those things in which folks criticized his leadership. And one of the things that came up in that research was the importance of the Civil Rights Act of 1957. Now, most people do not know much about the Civil Rights Act of 1957 because, in practical terms, it accomplishes very little. But still, it's significant because it is the first civil rights law to pass through the United States Senate since 1875, since the Reconstruction era. So its passage was pretty significant. And one of the things that I was doing research for, on the Civil Rights Act of 1957, and that would eventually become what my master's thesis focused on. One of the things I did was to spend time reading through the congressional record. And one of the things I noticed while doing that was that Southern arguments against the Civil Rights Act of 1957 were just different from what I had expected. There were lots of appeals to the Revolutionary era. There were lots of appeals to the Constitution. There was very little in the way of direct, overt race baiting. I said, man, there's a lot going on here. There's a lot to unpack in this story. Now, I had this idea that I would focus on the Civil Rights Act of 57 for the master's thesis, and I did that. But when I went on to go and get my PhD down the road at LSU, I wanted to expand this story and spend a lot of time looking at Southern politicians, Southern United States senators in particular, and look at their response to civil rights across a longer period of time. I'd already looked at 1957. I wanted to see the kind of arguments that Southern politicians were using in the 1960s. I wanted to see what kind of arguments they were using in the 1930s. And I wanted to see if there was some kind of trend here. Were the arguments that they raised against these various civil rights laws focused more on things like the Constitution, on the Revolution, on the American Civil War, things like that? Or were they what I expected them to be? Were they just race-baiting treatises, and were they just wasting time? In essence, was a Southern filibuster just these guys sitting around reading telephone books, doing all that kind of stuff, giving you their favorite recipes and all that on the Senate floor? Or was there some type of substance behind what they had to say? So in the process of working on that, we completed our doctoral dissertation, and that became the first book. Now I'm going to show a copy of that book because I want you all to buy it, but I'm going to show because it's an LSU Press book, so I'm sure LSU Press wouldn't mind me encouraging you to purchase another book besides the one we're talking about here today. That book is this one here, Delaying the Dream: Southern Senators and the Fight Against Civil Rights from 1938 to 1965. In that book, I spent a lot of time looking at the tactics, the ideology of your Southern United States senators as they fought against civil rights laws throughout the 20th century. Now, out of that book emerged the book we're talking about today, From Slavery to Segregation, because one of the things that stood out to me was, I want to know where all these arguments that Southerners are going to use from the New Deal era onward, where do these things come from? Were these things that were just uniquely created by Southern politicians in the 20th century as they faced challenges to the region's racial order? Or did they come from somewhere else? Did they have an earlier origins? And of course, as I began to do that research, I began to look back in time, and I started to look in that period in particular, from the American Civil War, the end of the Civil War, effectively the Reconstruction period, into the early 20th century. And a lot of other scholars have looked at that particular period in order to try to understand why the South emerged as it did after the Civil War, why the modern South arguments that we talked about in Delaying the Dream, why they took the shape that they did. And as I was doing that, I began to realize, man, this isn't early enough. I need to look even earlier in history to really find out where these arguments came from. And that kind of led me to, the trajectory that I followed for this particular book, where I go back into the 1830s and ultimately even before that, and look at the period, effectively 150, 200 years of Southern history. If you want to understand the New South, you want to understand the modern South, you have to understand the Old South. And that's kind of one of the things that's, a key feature of this book, From Slavery to Segregation. It's this notion that you have to understand Southern history, not in a small digestible piece, but you need to understand it in large chunks. And there's plenty of good history that's been done that deals with smaller subtopics. As I mentioned in this book, there's all, if you want to learn about the history of the South, there's probably a book that's going to interest you, whether it's a small study of a local community or a study of a larger city or a study of the civil rights struggle in a state or even in the entire region. There's 1, 2, 20 books that you can go and find that will cover all these topics. But what historians typically do, and what a lot of folks tend to do, is look at these things in digestible, bite-sized portions. So when we look at a lot of the modern civil rights movement literature, we see it focusing on that period from, let's say, World War II through the 1960s. Or we'll see books that cover the Reconstruction era. And even the Reconstruction era broadly defined as being that period from roughly the Emancipation Proclamation all the way through to the early 20th century, which is kind of the standard periodization for that era today. We see lots of scholars looking at small chunks of history. Now, I looked at those small periods of history, and I didn't find all the answers that I needed. But once I started going farther and farther back in time, I began to realize, man, this is where the threads that I saw when I first started my study of the Southern resistance to civil rights, when I first started looking at the Civil Rights Act of 1957, I started to see the origins of a lot of their ideas, not in the early 20th century, not in that period between Reconstruction and the early 20th century, the start of the Progressive era. I saw a lot of the origins of those ideas in the early part of the 19th century. I was like, now there's something to this. So what I wanted to do in this particular book was kind of trace those threads. I want to look at the early 19th century and I want to track across into the later part of the 20th century some of the major themes that I saw in Southern efforts to defend segregation, to defend slavery. So we kind of went and tied those two worlds together. And that's kind of the main intent of the book, is to say, hey, if you want to understand Jim Crow segregation and the defense of that institution that Southerners employed, you can look at the literature and you can look at primary sources from the 20th century, but it would really behoove you to look considerably sooner, because a lot of those ideas expressed in the 20th century emerged far, far sooner than we have traditionally kind of given it credit for. Now, in general, this book is broken up into 5 broad sections, and each chapter in this book represents a theme associated with my research. And the very first chapter is a great place to begin, especially for those people who are out in the audience who are maybe interested in this topic, maybe saw the title of the book and like, this is interesting. I don't really know much about it. The first chapter is a great place to start, because what I do there is provide a general history of effectively the American South from Jamestown to the 1970s. And it provides offers a chronological framework in which you can understand Southern history broadly defined. We touch upon some of the big political developments that resulted in things like the Civil War, that resulted in things like the Brown versus Board decision. And we kind of trace some of the main things that you'll need to understand if you're going to understand the rest of the book. Start with that first chapter, and that lays out all of the specifics, all of the details, all of the history that you'll need. And it's especially will be valuable to those who are not too sure about, let's say you study the 20th century US, maybe you're not too sure about the 19th century. This is going to provide you with that essential backdrop that you'll need to really understand the entirety of the work. And also in that chapter, we begin to start to identify some of those things that are unique in the South during both of those periods. And these are things that scholars have talked about before. We talk about things like this recognition on the part of Southern politicians, of Southern leaders, that look, we're different than the rest of this nation. It's increasingly becomes a narrative in which it's us against them. And you really start to see, especially in the South, the emergence of what we call the beleaguered South, the besieged South. You see that kind of spirit emerging in the 1850s onward. Before that, when I talk about the South is an expansionist region in this country. They have this aggressive campaign, this aggressive vision of what the South could be, of this vast slave-holding republic that spans across from one ocean to another. It's an expansionist tendency that encompasses the Caribbean basin and points southward. It's a very broad, outward-looking South. But as pressure starts to come onto the region and to visit the region about the institution of slavery, especially about the expansion of slavery, and as Southerners start to see the deck being stacked against them in Washington, they begin to start looking at the political lens before them in a very different manner. And they start to grow concerned about what the future might bring. That's when we start to see that siege mentality that we often associate with the Southern region. It's that sense of us against them. It's that siege mentality that never goes away, that continues into the 20th century. And that's what the first chapter really focuses on. The big difference, of course, in the age of segregation is segregationists aren't trying to expand their worldview. They just want to preserve what they have where they are. So it's more in keeping with how the South was, let's say, in the 1850s than it was maybe in the 1830s. But that's kind of what the first chapter encompasses. Chapter 2, of course, deals with the mythology of the South. And what we mean by this is, what Southerners believed about themselves, how they wanted to be perceived. There has been an avalanche of books in the past 20 years that have looked at things like Southern paternalism and have made the argument, well, paternalism was a myth. It didn't exist at all. Slaves were mistreated. They were never viewed as members of their family and all that. Yes, that's true. We all know that. I'm not sure we needed all those books to point that out, but we have them. This book, my book, doesn't say paternalism was real in the sense that, if you looked at the relationship on the plantation, it doesn't say that at all. But what I do say in here is that paternalism is still important, even if it's not actualized in practice. It's an important way, an ordering mechanism within the South. White Southerners didn't live up to the ideal, but the ideal was still there. And it wasn't just an empty window dressing to say, well, look, we treat our slaves well, because they know they don't. It means something to them. It helps them identify the world around them, identify their place in that world. It becomes the essential vision for how someone should comport themselves, even if they don't actually comport themselves in that manner. It becomes the vision of how they should be and how that one should act. So I take the views regarding Southern paternalism that white Southerners use, and I take it at face value, knowing, of course, obviously, that there are serious flaws with the idea, but I accept it as, hey, at the time, the people who promulgated these ideas believed in what they were saying, believed that they were true. So we assess that things like paternalism through that lens. And of course, we carry the vision into the 20th century. How do white Southerners adapt the spirit of paternalism to fit the needs of the 20th century? Because the 20th century segregation is obviously different than 19th century's the institution of slavery. These are two very, very different entities. And we spend a lot of time in this particular chapter kind of looking at how white Southerners adopt some of the trappings of paternalism with the understanding that paternalism in the 19th century sense was different in the 20th century sense. So I urge you to kind of look at this is something that really interests you, man, take a look at chapter 2. You'll really find it of great value. The third chapter in this particular book focuses on race. It is the unavoidable component of the slave system, of the Jim Crow system. You don't have either of those institutions, obviously, without this notion that there is some racial hierarchy in the world. If you look at the antebellum period, you look at the Jim Crow era, you see some shocking and disturbing arguments in defense of those racial institutions that are tied directly to the institute, tied directly to concepts of race and these really disturbing images of racism that today will really shock modern sensibilities. Again, we have to spend time looking at these historical actors in the context of their times. And we look at these arguments and we lay out these arguments for the reader to kind of get a sense of what in the world are these people thinking. And, we provide the arguments that they unfold. And some of these arguments are so ridiculous. And when we look at them from the modern lens, yet they persist over time. One of the most famous of these is something called the curse of Ham, which is taken from the book of Genesis, from the Bible. And, it's something that you start to see in the European world roughly the 1600s onward, in those periods of that first exploration of the Europeans to places like Africa. And they embraced this notion of the curse of Ham. And the idea was that the Canaanites, the descendants of Ham, were cursed by God effectively. And that was believed by people who were studying the Bible, was that the Canaanites were black, that their curse of Ham, the mark was their skin color. And you see the curse of Ham being used in the 19th century, which is one thing. But you see that same curse of Ham. I remember looking at Citizens Council literature for this book in the 1950s and the 1960s, and they're still talking about the curse of Ham, and still using that directly, just as if they had just lifted it out of a text from 1845 and put it into 1964. They're still using that. And what's interesting about that, and it's one of the things that I point out throughout this book, is that all roads lead back to race. When we spend time talking about mythology, the reason the White South created the mythology it had for itself in the Old South and the New South and the Modern South was in part as a defense for those racial institutions, for segregation, for slavery. Even in the 20th century, as we noted, especially as you go along over time. And one of the things that I spend a lot of time doing in this book is reminding readers that although we are focusing here on the South, it's really important to remember that things like racial prejudice and all that was a universal thing in the United States, that it exists and is widespread in the North. And I point that out regularly. And I also allow some of the Southern voices that I study in this book to fill the pages with their critique of the North, where they make the case that, look, our free people here are doing better than your northern factory workers. The free black population in the South has a better standard of living than free blacks in Philadelphia, than free blacks in New York, because there's prejudice, there's discrimination against people of color throughout the nation. And that's an important thing that I try to point out. But of course, as you get into the 20th century, and as momentum behind things like racial change really starts to take off, one of the things that you see is that, at least in the public setting, before a broad national audience, you'll see Southern politicians starting to downplay the importance of race in their arguments. But those very same politicians, when they go back home and talk to their constituents in Mississippi, Louisiana, Alabama, they will use the same old racial invective you see everywhere. So there's kind of a two-tiered argument that emerges in the segregated South and the 20th century South. It's that defensive Jim Crow that relies more and more on the Constitution and such on the national level, but on the state level, nothing changes. Was always about race, and it remains about race until the end. So that's what that particular chapter covers. Chapter 4 is one of the ones that I think folks find that at least I've spoken with thus far who've looked at the book find of most interest and most value, is studies the importance of the Constitution and white Southerners, how they have interpreted the Constitution to defend slavery and how they use the Constitution to defend Jim Crow segregation. And they make these arguments in which they make the case that we are the ones who are preserving the Constitution, whereas the abolitionists, whereas the civil rights activists, they are twisting the Constitution, perverting the Constitution to suit their needs. So you see throughout these period, there's this 150-year, 200-year period that is the focus of my book. You see white Southerners regularly referring to the Constitution, how what they're doing is consistent with the intent of the founding generation, that they are the ones who are preserving the Constitution as the founders intended, and that everyone else is destroying the Constitution. And they make that case, and we've seen this case made over and over and over again. I know back in the 1970s, when Edmund Morgan came out with that book, American Slavery, American Freedom, people were aghast. How could he possibly make this claim that there is some kind of correlation between American freedom, independence, and all that kind of stuff and the institution of slavery? If you read the people that are the subject of my book, if you read the things that they wrote in the 1830s, 1840s, 1850s, you know exactly how Edmund Morgan reached that conclusion, because they say it, and they say it often in their writing. We people, we of the slaveholding South, appreciate liberty, appreciate freedom, because we see what not having freedom is all around us. We are exalted by the presence of slavery around us. Therefore, we really sanctify these ideas of liberty and freedom and all that. So we talk about all of those things in chapter 4 of this book. And it's one of those things where if you're really interested in, how the Constitution can be used and abused, this is a really good chapter to look at, because it covers a lot of those things throughout this 200-year period of history in which we see an interpretation of the Constitution being advanced that is really, really stagnant and limited in its perspective, but it shapes how these white Southerners kind of frame the fight that they have and how they urge others to rally to them. The final chapter here, chapter 5, deals with the tactics, less so than the ideas, although it includes a lot of ideas as well. But one of the things that I wanted to point out here, since so much of what we talk about reflects continuity in the South, that reflects this kind of commonality of a belief system. Although, as we mentioned earlier, concepts like paternalism are by default going to evolve over time, because you're dealing with very different racial institutions in that of slavery and that of segregation. The final chapter focuses more on the tactics, and I look at what I call the moments of truth in the old South, the moment of truth in the new South / modern South. The moment of truth, of course, that I look at in the lead up to the American Civil War, in the life of the institution of slavery, is that moment of truth in that period from John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry to Abraham Lincoln's election in 1860 and ultimately Southern secession. That in this year and several month period of time, white Southerners kind of gravitate towards breaking away from the Union. We spend a lot of time looking at the arguments that are in place. And there's a very clear sense in those arguments. And we looked at a wide variety of individuals, for everyone from someone who's going to be famous like Jefferson Davis, all the way down to local newspapers in southern cities, to get a sense of, well, how did the region view the coming of the Civil War? And of course, it's not as uniform as you would imagine, which is another one of the themes that comes out in this book, is that there are many Souths. Although we talk about, and we're talking exclusively here about the white South, it's, we point out a lot in here that Southerners differed on how they view these things. It just makes sense that they're not just all staunch defenders of slavery. They're not just all staunch defenders of segregation, that there's gradations between those who believe in, hey, let's absolutely break away from the Union now, versus those who are like, I don't think this is a good idea. But in the end, when the South's racial system faced an overt direct attack, and this is what they believed was taking place in 1859 and 1860. They believed that with the Republican Party now in control of the White House, with the Northern perspective dominant in both the Senate and the House, the South was in trouble. Nothing was going to go the South's way. In fact, their belief was, hey, even if Abe Lincoln doesn't believe in ending slavery and he just believes in limiting the westward growth of slavery, there will come a time when the people who surround Abe Lincoln are going to push for the end of slavery, and there's nothing the South can do about it, because they're a minority now in the United States in all chambers of the government. So the belief was, let's leave the Union now while we still have a chance, and we'll leave en masse and leave together and hopefully stay independent, and without having to fight a war. We know that's not how that goes. On the other side of the equation, you look at the segregationists. And segregationists, certainly on the national level, as I pointed out in Delaying the Dream, and as I point out in here, Southern segregationists, certainly by the mid-1930s, they start to see trouble brewing against the region's racial institutions. They start to see what they believe to be this kind of cabal of interests that are moving towards trying to strip the South of some of its unique characteristics. And by unique characteristics, they mean their racial institutions. But you really don't start to see the panic button being hit until you get to that Brown v. Board decision. Then all of a sudden, it's widespread panic. That's the moment of truth in the 20th century segregationist South. But what I point out in this particular chapter is how white Southerners responded was all over the map. In the lead up to America's Civil War, the secession movement was much more aggressive in organization, in organizing folks and getting folks to fall in line with the push towards secession and why it was necessary. On the segregationist front, it was chaotic. You have far less unity amongst white Southerners. A lot of folks are like, look, this is the Supreme Court that's ruled. There's nothing we can do about it. And I often tell my students in class, I use Alan Ellender as an example. And Alan Ellender is a senator from down here in Louisiana. And Alan Ellender is going to tell one of his friends, he's like, look, I don't think there's anything we can do anymore. And I feel guilty telling my constituents in the wake of Brown that there's things we can do to ameliorate the problem of segregation, try to preserve segregation. It's going to happen. We're going to be forced to integrate. The court is sets these standards, and if the court decides it, eventually it's going to come to pass. But what Alan Ellender didn't do was tell his constituents that. He doesn't tell white Louisianans, look, guys, the show is over. We better get ready for what's coming. He joins the ranks of those who was going to say a lot of things, speak strong rhetoric and all this, kind of urging folks to stand up and try to resist integration wherever you can. But these efforts to resist integration are scattershot. Some places, the fight to preserve segregation is feverish and intense, and in other places, it's far less organized, far less intense, and integration comes to pass with far less aggression and violence and all those kind of things. So what do we get out of this then? You're probably sitting there asking, okay, well, Finley just ran down the 5 chapters, but I want you to go get the book, so I don't want to go into too much detail on these, but there is that commonality of ideas here that spans this 200-year period. There is this emphasis on things like states' rights, of course. There's an emphasis on things like individual rights. There's an emphasis on things like property rights. There's an intense fear of centralized governmental authority and what that might do to the South, and especially to its racial institutions. There is an intense fear of outsiders, this idea that outside forces are arrayed against the South. And that's one of the things we talk a lot about in this book, is this notion of the slippery slope. But one of the things I wanted to get in mind, point out, and it kind of ties in with what I discussed with the end of with the final chapter, was this notion that white Southerners, the resistance efforts were scattershot. And there's a quote from Russell Long of Louisiana that I think really kind of speaks to what was going on here. Because, the idea that, well, we pass a bunch of civil rights laws in the 1960s, and there's a lot of court rulings, that kind of indicates that racial change was going to come to the American South, and that was going to be the end of the story. We all know that's not the case. And I have an interesting quote here from Russell Long, which kind of captures the spirit of that. And I feel like one of those, literature guys, and I'm going to pull out my book and read from it like I'm reading from a poem. This is no poem, folks, but it's taken directly from the new book. And this is Russell Long in 1964. Russell Long, he's on a national television program, Meet the Press type of program, and he's being asked, in the middle of the fight over the 1964 civil rights law, which will effectively end Jim Crow segregation. He's like, how do you feel about this? And what do you think is going to happen to the nation? And he makes the case. Russell Long will say, and I quote, "No doubt, this nation will continue to be a nice country to live in, regardless of the outcome of the integration fight." Now, that doesn't sound like somebody who's overly committed to preserving Jim Crow segregation. But later on, there's an important piece of that story, which also stands out. And Russell Long will say ultimately that, yes, this law is probably going to pass, and there's not much we can do about it. But he says, "We think it is absolutely desirable that the white people should continue to be white, and that their children and grandchildren should be the same. And we let our children know that we think just that." So think about what Russell Long is saying here. Russell Long is very clearly making the case that, okay, the civil rights bill is going to pass. There's going to be integration in public places and all that, but it doesn't matter. Jim Crow may be gone, but the importance of race in the South is not necessarily going to go away. It's still going to be there, but it's going to assume a different form, and it's going to be passed on generationally. It's one of the things you still see in some places today. Russell Long is kind of given that warning to the national media. Look, there's going to be some changes, but not so fast. The final thing I wanted to talk about here before I close up, and I know I'm getting running long here, and I know Sonny is probably sitting there on the other side of the camera like, when is he going to stop? I'm going to stop in a few seconds, Sonny. But one last thing I wanted to talk about, what I mentioned before, was this notion of the slippery slope. And it's something that I think is we see a lot in present day politics, where we see a lot of politicians talking about, hey, if you pass this law, then this bill is going to come, and this is going to happen, and this is going to happen. It's never going to end. White Southerners use this trope throughout the 18th and the 19th into the 20th centuries. They use this constantly. I'll give you an example here from George Fitzhugh. George Fitzhugh is a Virginian, and George Fitzhugh is going to say this about abolitionists. And he's going to make the case of what abolitionists, their real goals are. So he's speaking in 1857 here to give you a sense. So this is before the American Civil War, but he sees the handwriting on the wall, and he's outlining a slippery slope. Fitzhugh will say, first, domestic slavery, next, religious institutions, then separate property, then political government, and finally, family government and family relations are to be swept away. And what he's referring to is what he called Black Republicanism as the harbinger of socialism in America. And he goes on from there, and he makes the case that George Fitzhugh posited that the North, not the South, is the true battleground of the mislabeled abolitionist crusade. Think about that for a moment. George Fitzhugh is making the case that abolitionism is not just aimed at undermining slavery in the South. It's aimed at destroying American institutions, destroying religious institutions, political institutions, family institutions. That's a pretty bold statement. And to follow up on that, to give you a sense of what we mean by this slippery slope idea, let this happen, and there's a lot of other things that are coming. Think about segregationists in the 20th century. I use a brief quote here from Richard Russell from the state of Georgia. Now, Richard Russell will become one of the leaders of Southern resistance efforts against civil rights advances, especially in the United States Senate. And Richard Russell will say in 1938, as Southerners are facing an anti-lynching bill that year, and it's a bill that a lot of national media types were telling the Southerners, look, just let it pass. It's not going to do much to change what's going on in the South. By 1938, the number of lynchings had dropped significantly in the region, so it's just a minor bill. Let it pass. But Richard Russell has reservations about that, and here are his reservations. There is no question that if we are finally exhausted and permit the passage of the anti-lynching bill, it would be followed by legislation to break down segregation of the races in schools, hospitals, churches, restaurants, hotels, bathhouses, and all other public places, as well as by bills giving the ballot to every Negro and striking down state statutes preventing intermarriage of the races. There you have it right there in kind of a nutshell. You have the leader of Southern forces in the age of Jim Crow. You have one of the foremost spokesmen for the pro-slavery cause in the 1800s, both of them using this kind of slippery slope narrative to explain what's going to happen. You can see that, of course, is still very much alive today. And we see politicians in both parties making those arguments. If this happens, this is going to happen. If you let this person win, all these horrible things are going to take place in the nation. Man, it sounds exactly like this particular group of politicians. One of the things that points that I make here in this particular case is, these what are distinctly Southern narratives that we use in this story. We need to keep in mind that these narratives also become American narratives as well. And I like to say there is the Southernization of American politics, which takes place where folks in the upper Midwest and folks in the upper and New England and folks out West, a lot of them have a worldview, a conservative political worldview that is in part shaped by the people who I talk about in this particular book. But I guess I've said enough, and I'll leave the floor open now to questions.
Thank you. Our first question in the audience comments is from Brian. Question is, in your opinion, given the topics you've discussed today, will the white South embrace the multiracial America that is moving inevitably forward should Kamala win the election?
Well, one of the things that I try to do as a historian is to avoid talking about contemporary events. But to speak to this author's point, I think it's inevitable, and I think it's one of the changes that you see taking place in this region. Now, remember the Russell Long quote: we teach our children to be against this, this, and this. But Russell Long said that in the 1960s. We're now in 2024. And I think a growing number of young people, especially across the South, have abandoned a lot of this racial baggage that has plagued the region and the nation, for that matter, for much of its history. And now, speaking in the short term about the election of an individual candidate, what makes this so difficult is, in the modern age, people just can't talk about politics anymore on both sides of the political aisle. I have friends who are Democrats, I have friends who are Republicans, and they cannot have a conversation with someone of the other political party. They start frothing at the mouth as they start railing against what this person's election might mean to America. And they've lost the ability to speak with each other and to rationally have a conversation. It reminds me very much of the besieged South that we talk about in here, where any outside ideas are considered negative. If it speaks ill about us in any way, we hate it, and we're going to try to block its transmission into our region. We see a lot of that. But I think the future is good. And to answer Brian's question, I could see it through my students. Each year, and like I said, I've been here in the Deep South for 25 years now. And one of the things I've seen over the course of that 25 years is just a difference in how people perceive things like race. So, are we at a colorblind society? No. Are we moving in that direction? I would like to think so. And I think there is hope, Brian, although sometimes it doesn't always seem that way. I think that, things are looking better than maybe it appears to some folks looking on.
Thank you. Can you talk more about the ideas in this book and how you bring them to your classroom and sort of incorporate them into the teaching that you do there?
Okay. It's something that my students can tell you, much to their dismay, that I don't say, "Well, I got this book coming out, and you should buy it." Although maybe I should do that, but I tell my students, well, as I'm telling these stories, one of the things I always stress in the classroom is, look, we have to break free from our perspective in the 21st century, where we have a very clear vision of what's we view the world through the prism of today. We have to step back in time and understand these actors in the context of their times. So I always tell students, look, you can look at these politicians, you can look at these, cultural leaders in the South throughout the 19th century into the 20th century, and it's easy to just dismiss them. These guys are a bunch of racists, which they are by the 21st century standards, and you could just dismiss them as that. But what I try to do is to get my students to kind of unzip the narrative that these guys are saying and try to understand it in the context of the time. Why might they think this way? Why do they perceive the election of Abraham Lincoln as such a harbinger of doom, rather than as just another presidential election that we can move on from? And I spend a lot of time trying to get students to understand the other side. History's losers in this case, which is what these guys are, not to celebrate them or anything like that, but to understand them. And that's kind of what our job is as historians, is to understand these people. And also, of course, I mention a lot of these things, and students very quickly start to connect how some of the arguments that are being had taking place in the 1840s or the 1940s are very similar to the ones that are taking place now. And it kind of helps students to connect the present to the past by kind of integrating some of the stories that I share in this particular book with the class. So it's just a way, what I always try to do is to bring that information to them and, let them decide on their own, but give them the tools they need to really understand this period. I always jokingly tell my classes, when I was going to school, and I always use the example of my fifth grade class. I was in fifth grade in New York, and I remember being told, the good guys won the Civil War. And I still believe that to be true because as a Yankee, I have no choice. But I also believe that the end goal that the war brought about was a positive. But the reality is, good guys, well, most of those Northern soldiers didn't go to war to end slavery. That wasn't their intention at all. A lot of them were drafted and forced to fight and all of that. And, they're not necessarily good guys as we'd view them today, even if their cause was a just one. So I do a lot of that, just getting my students accustomed to breaking outside of their current views on things and try to understand the actors in the past on their own terms. without sacrificing your kind of modern moral compass. Because it's still fine to say that George Fitzhugh was completely wrong and was a terrible human being. But let's try to understand George Fitzhugh in the context of his time. And that's what we spend a lot of time doing.
Thank you. Our next question is from Carl in the comments. Question is, do you think the brutality and severity of the Civil War, especially in the South psyche, can be blamed for the amount of time it has taken the U.S. to evolve to what everyone believes is inevitable?
I think that's a good way of looking at it, because once in the early stages after the Civil War, the South is defeated and it's beaten badly, and all of that talk of one rebel can whip 10 Yankees, well, maybe he could, but they still lost the war, and the impact of that was profound. And not only was the impact of it profound, but there also was a sense that this was the cause of a single group of people, that this was the cause of the Republican Party. And I use that term when I quoted from the George Fitzhugh, the idea of black republicanism. And that idea is going to circulate in the South for many, many years. Today we see the Republican Party having a very strong presence in this region. But obviously that's a relatively new phenomenon. Much of Southern history is defined by the Democratic Party being the party that was in control in the South. It's the party of slavery. It's the party of the Civil War. It's the party of Jim Crow segregation. And so the political party apparatus as it emerges in the South, especially after the Civil War, is the uni-party state, where it's the Democratic Party, and that's largely it, with a few exceptions, of course, in certain places in Texas and the mountains of Tennessee. So we can find examples of there being an alternative to the Democratic stranglehold on the region. But for a long period of time, it's the only show in town. So the political party in the system the political system that exists in the South is one that is embedded in the siege mentality of us against them. So it's us against the world. And that absolutely permeates the South for generations. And it's tied to what they always considered the dark days of Reconstruction, the dark days of the Civil War. And you see well into the 20th century, I look at some of those civil rights debates in Washington over the Civil Rights Act of 64, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, the idea of the Reconstruction era being this dark chapter in American history in which outside forces were trying to take away the rights and freedoms of white Southerners, is kind of the narrative that they shared. And because of that, meaningful change is difficult to bring about, because you have a region that's so wedded to that period after the Civil War. And we always talk about the myth of the lost cause. And certainly by the time you get to the 1890s, the South was commemorating the war that in the early stages after the war, people wanted to forget. And it was kind of a source of embarrassment. By the time you get into the 1890s, then that Confederate war effort completely transforms and it becomes something that you celebrate. You start seeing those Southern communities across the region start putting up those markers and monuments commemorating the war dead, not just in the cemeteries where they had been relegated before, but now right dead in the center of the town square. And, that vision of the past kind of shaped the future for a long, long time. And I think, unfortunately, as Carl pointed out, or Carl's question suggests, it really speaks to why change came so slowly. Because you have a region in which the lost cause, in which the loss of the end of slavery, in which this occupation by a foreign force, by Yankee invaders, that's going to invade during the Civil War, but then are going to stay there during that period of radical Reconstruction, bring all kinds of change to the region. Man, hatred of that period is going to shape decades and decades to come. And we see that, throughout all the way into the later part of the 20th century. So yes, the impact of that period is profound, and it prevents a meaningful discussion of maybe Jim Crow isn't a good idea. Maybe if we got rid of Jim Crow, that might open the doors for opportunity. That might open the doors for businesses to head southward. to invest in this region. But there's that reluctance, at least, especially as you have the emergence of the grassroots civil rights protest effort take place. You start to see a lot of businesses kind of like, maybe we would like to do business in the South, especially because of the right to work tradition and all that kind of thing, which makes it appealing. But then you have this simmering racial unrest, and that's not going to work out too. So that's not going to work out for us economically. So we want to stay out of that altogether. Think about what that does. That means that because of the defense of this racial system, which is rooted in the Civil War period and the Reconstruction period, you remain wedded into it because you buy into the mythology surrounding it well into the 20th century. You prevent meaningful change. You prevent industrialization. You prevent the influx of immigrants. You prevent the influx of meaningful change. And that's really powerful. And again, it's one of those things that when we look at this period in history, we look at in the 20th century in particular, we look at it and we're like, well, how could these people not have seen the mistake in their ways? And, we forget how deeply embedded these beliefs were. Remember, it's not just, as Russell Long pointed out, parents and grandparents telling their children and grandchildren, you need to keep the races separate, but it's something that is introduced in all aspects of life. You see it in public before you. Whites go here, blacks go here. You see whites entering the front door, blacks being able to go through the back. Those kind of things kind of influence people throughout the region. It's an idea that stays in the school system well into the 20th century, where children are taught, hey, this is why we have separation of the races. This is why things are the way they are. And you have politicians reinforcing those things all stages of your life, from cradle to grave, in essence. You're kind of surrounded by the necessity of Jim Crow. Think about what that does. You believe it because that's the world you grew up in. So, yeah, absolutely. Meaningful change thwarted because of that. But again, I'd like to say, optimistically, perhaps, and folks have said that I'm sometimes naively optimistic about things. But I believe that meaningful change is taking place now. Albeit slowly, but I see it in the young people absolutely.
Thank you. Well, that is our last question, so we can go ahead and say thank you and goodbye to our audience.
All right. Thank you everyone for showing up. My students, how you doing, guys? And my wife, hey.